Aloha from the East-West Center in Honolulu, and mahalo to viewers around the world for tuning in to today's EWC Seminars Live briefing, Partisan Warfare and Voting in 2020 America. Our bi-monthly EWC Seminars Live series is designed for multinational journalists and informed audiences to connect, inform, and source media stories. My name is Liz A. Dorn, and I'm a program coordinator at the center. And it's my pleasure to introduce today's panel of former presidential speechwriters offering their thoughts on the 2020 elections and how they may reshape the Republican and Democratic parties and American democracy itself. Ms. Mary Kate Carey is a senior fellow at the University of Virginia's Miller Center and an adjunct professor in UVA's Department of Politics. Mary Kate served as a White House speechwriter for President George H.W. Bush from 1989 to early 1992. After leaving office, she became Deputy Director of Communications at the Republican National Committee, and in 2014, she executive produced 41 on 41, an internationally released documentary in which 41 extraordinary storytellers shared their best stories about President Bush 41. Mr. David Litt is the author of the 2020 book, Democracy in One Book or Less: How It Works, Why It Doesn't, and Why Fixing It is Easier Than You Think, as well as the 2017 best-selling memoir, Thanks Obama, My Hopey-Changey White House Years. David served as a senior presidential speechwriter and special assistant to President Barack Obama from 2011 to 2016, and was the lead joke writer for several White House correspondents' dinner monologues. He also served as the head writer-producer for Funny or Die DC through the 2018 midterm elections. Thank you both. And I would like to take a moment now to share our briefing protocols. Today's public briefing is on the record, recorded on Zoom, and made available on YouTube for viewing and sharing. Viewers, your microphones and videos, as well as the Q&A function, are all turned off. Each panelist will speak for up to 15 minutes and will comment on one another's remarks. Following the panelists' formal remarks, the public portion of the briefing will conclude. Pre-selected journalists will then be invited to remain for an on-the-record Q&A session beginning no later than 4:45. Join the conversation on Twitter using hashtag EWC Seminars Live, and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at EWC Seminars. Check out our website for webinar information, registration, full speaker bios, and YouTube links at www.eastwestcenter.org/EWC Seminars Live. From there, you can also access information about other professional opportunities, as the center offers a diverse array of media, leadership, and educational programs. And with that, I will hand over the program to Mary Kate and David. Mary Kate?
Mahalo, Liz. Thank you for having me. David and I share a passion for speechwriting, but we've also both gotten involved with new projects that bring us together for this conversation. David, as you just heard, has written a book on democracy, and I started teaching at the University of Virginia. And I'm co-teaching a class that starts tomorrow morning called Election 2020, and it covers many aspects of this fall's election. 200 kids have signed up, and it's going to be a total blast, I think, completely online, by the way. So I'm hoping to share some of the information that we're going to use for that class with you this afternoon. I'll start with some of the factors that I see fueling the rise in partisanship during COVID, the possibility of new voters and voters crossing party lines, and then discuss the prospects for party realignment. So let's start with what's making this election unlike any other, and that is, of course, COVID-19 and its effects on the parties. Wide majorities of voters believe that the pandemic will disrupt our election and that the potential for election chaos is clear, especially in a system where control over our election process is handled at the state level and is handled differently in all 50 states. So I thought I'd start with some of the consequences of the pandemic for some of the key events in our election process. As you're seeing this week and last, live tonight, while we're talking, the conventions for both parties have gone virtual. And I think it's affected the partisan tone just a bit. The good news is the speeches are shorter. I don't know about David, but I'm a big believer in short speeches, and many of them are taped in advance. Most of the Democratic speeches did not have an audience. A few had reporters who were not allowed to clap. There are Republicans, though, do seem to have some smaller socially distanced audiences, but not many. I've been pleasantly surprised at the production quality of both conventions, even though it's a little less exciting. The Republicans only put out a 2-page agenda for a second term for the president instead of a platform, which I think a lot of people were surprised at. The Democrats were especially quiet on policy as well. They did put together a platform, but didn't seem to talk about it much during prime time, and instead chose to go a more full bore on the president's character. And I think they made a bit of a strategic mistake doing that because the GOP convention, at least last night, I haven't watched yet tonight, was much heavier on policy and was designed to appeal to swing voters and independents who may not like Trump personally, but may reluctantly vote for him because they've benefited from some of his policies. We heard from a lot of everyday Americans last night. I expect that will continue all week. And that could result in some people switching over who didn't vote for him in the first place, but have benefited. And I'll talk about party realignment on that in just a moment. As far as the campaign trail going into the fall, not having the candidates in the public eye nearly as much as we're used to is going to be a little unusual. And that's its own form of exclusion. Voters, especially new ones, and key groups won't have the opportunity to secure promises and sort of judge in person who they want to vote for. As far as the debates go, my recommendation would be to move up the debates because of early voting. There are voters who will start casting ballots in the next few weeks, and yet the debates don't start until September 29th and then run through October 22nd. And I think there's a lot of people who would like to see the candidates side by side before they vote for, and early voting might preempt that. As far as the potential for chaos and sort of exclusion from the voting process, let me just say that some states have a long history of mail-in voting and absentee ballots. Oregon, for example, has had universal mail-in voting for a generation. And it is the states, though, that have recently switched to these methods in the face of COVID-19 that really create the cause for concern. And this could mean that many people's votes end up being excluded. The problem is not necessarily the Postal Service, despite all the coverage lately. I'm more worried about what happens when the hundreds of thousands of ballots actually get delivered and there's no system for counting them quickly and accurately. Let me share this slide with you real quick here. Here we go. So this is a map of the United States, and you'll see how many states right now have some form of vote by mail, and that's in these various shades of green. The yellow squares mark 20 different states which recently made a change, and the majority of those 20 states decided to automatically send either applications or ballots to all voters for the first time just now. Hang on. I think if I go like, there we go. We've already seen a surge in mail-in voting during the primaries that took place after COVID hit. For example, in the early states, South Carolina in February, the percentage of mail-in ballots was in the single digits, as it was in 5 out of 8 of the Super Tuesday states in early March. But by June, in all 5 of the primaries on June 2nd, the majority of total votes cast were by mail-in vote. Rhode Island, 83% of the votes in Rhode Island were cast by mail. If you want to talk about numbers instead of percentages, in New York City, 2018 midterms, 23,000 mail-in votes were sent in. Just now this spring, over 400,000. Every American who wants to vote during the pandemic should be able to vote. The way to do that is through mail-in voting. It helps make it easier for non-voters to join the ranks of voters. But does mail-in voting have to be a partisan issue? I would make the case that Republican candidates could benefit from mail-in voting, contrary to what the president's been saying, because the demographics of who is most likely to stay home and avoid mail-in voting aligns with people who are often Republicans. For example, rural voters, where it's a long trip to the polling station, small business owners who may not be able to take the day off, the self-employed, seniors, overseas veterans, people like that. It may also help to offset the Democrats who have early voting advantages when it comes to in-person voting, mostly because a lot of the early in-person voting is held in major urban centers where young people are. There's not that many rural early voting locations. Another thing to think about is shortage of poll workers and voting site closures, which may further exclude some voters as well. More than half of poll workers are older than 61 years old. At least that was true 4 years ago, according to Pew. I think a lot of those older retirees who volunteer have very legitimate COVID concerns about showing up at the polls to work all day. One example, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, typically needs 1,400 poll workers. As of right now, they only have 400 signed up. So I'm not making the argument that mail-in voting is bad in the long run. I'm making the opposite argument. Most Americans support it, polls show, or that I don't argue either that fraud would be rampant. But there is a serious problem this year with volunteers, infrastructure, and voter education, which all means that we have a long way to go before we can ensure mail-in voting will work this November. We don't want a situation in which it takes weeks before the election can be called, or weeks and months where we're spent litigating the issue, as we saw in the 2000 election. So another factor in terms of partisan warfare is the role of the media, with hardening views and perceptions of the American media. In the minds of many voters, it has become Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, MSNBC versus Fox News. A lot of it's become attached to voter identity. So let me show you another slide here. And we've got Pew Research showing that Democrats express more trust of the news sources that I just mentioned, that the mainstream Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, the network news is ABC, NBC, CBS. Democrats trust more than distrust the majority of those sources. You'll see right here, Democrats distrust far more of those sources than trust them. The trust is in red there. And this really has implications for the partisan tone, because so many people identify with their parties and therefore start distrusting what they're hearing from the news, which I think is adding to this sense of partisan warfare. Let me also show you this one. Republicans are far more confident than Democrats that the November election will be open and accurate. If you look here, you see people believe that the election will be conducted fairly and accurately. Far more Republicans over here agree with that statement. Far more Democrats disagree. The lowest numbers you see are Black and liberal Democrats have the least confidence that the election will be fair and accurate. Over here, you see all citizens who want to be able to vote in the election should be able to. High majorities of Republicans believe that's what will happen. Much lower numbers here. Liberal Democrats do not think that's going to happen. So that's troubling as well. When you talk about the partisanship that's growing in terms of the confidence in the election results, that last slide I showed you, earlier in the election season, we heard President Trump saying he wouldn't commit to whether he would accept the results. Just today, Hillary Clinton advised Joe Biden not to concede under any circumstances. I find that both of those statements by both sides very destabilizing. And Pew has polling showing that the majority of Americans of both parties think that it is important for the losing candidate to publicly concede. So let me just move now to party realignment. One of the things we talk about in my class at the big picture level is the difference between party sorting and polarization. Party sorting is when you have a situation where everybody who's liberal is in the Democratic Party and everybody who's conservative is in the Republican Party. An unsorted party situation would be where you have the Democratic Party and there are liberal, moderate, and conservative Democrats, and you have liberal, moderate, and conservative Republicans, as you saw in the United States 25, 30 years ago When I first got into politics in the 1988 campaign, that was certainly the case. Today, though, pretty much everybody who's liberal is in the Democratic Party, and everybody who's conservative is in the Republican Party, as the parties sort more and more. The difference between that and polarization is when you're polarized, two parties are separated, but there are no independents in the middle. Everyone is either red or blue. There's no purple. Today in the United States, the elites are polarized. People David and I would call sort of the blue check Twitter crowd, extremely polarized, but most American voters are not. We still have many independent voters in this country. Party affiliation is dropping for both parties. There have always been more Democrats than Republicans, but Democratic Party ID is shrinking. According to Gallup, from a high of 11 points difference, more Democrats than Republicans in June, now there's only 6 points between Republicans and Democrats. The largest group of voters that now self-identify is independents, 38% in Pew. And as both parties' ID is going down, the number of independents is growing. So that means that polarization of the electorate is not as bad as polarization of the people at the top. So party sorting has led to unstable majorities, fewer landslide elections, House, Senate, and White House party control flipping more often than it usually does in the past. And it makes it much harder to build bipartisan coalitions because it's difficult to compromise. There's no conservative Republicans reaching out to conservative liberals, or conservative Democrats to try and pull something together. As a result, voters are frustrated with gridlock. They have this sense of vote them all out, have a pox on both their houses. And so that's where the politics stands right now. So in terms of the prospects for the parties, depending on who wins and what Trump and Biden wins will look like for each of the parties after the election, here's where I'm coming from on that. If Trump wins, despite being in the White House, I think Trump will remain an outsider populist. As we saw last night, there is little to no establishment Republican leadership at the GOP convention. There are no Hollywood types, unlike the Democratic convention. Biden has become more and more the representative of cultural elites, Hollywood stars, establishment Democrats, former presidents, national security advisors, things like that. Trump's campaign, at least last night, the convention, very heavy on everyday Americans. No former presidents are going to be there. Trump will win if he expands his base and not just hardens it. And the way to do that, to expand his base, is through emphasizing policies and not his personality. This phenomenon I talked about earlier, people who don't care for him personally, but think he's benefited them in terms of what he's done for the economy. His second term agenda that was announced this week, he's proposing 10 million jobs in 10 months. He wants to keep going with deregulation, greater shift away from globalization. He wants a vaccine by the end of this year. He wants to cut prescription drug prices. And most importantly, lately, he's supporting law enforcement and wants to lower the levels of violent crime. Why the Democrats did not discuss the violent crime rates in the major urban areas right now at their convention is beyond me, because I think it opened a huge opening for the Republicans. If Biden wins, the push to the left will continue, boosted by Kamala Harris as vice president. I think the Justice Democrats and a lot of the progressives are gaining strength. And I believe the Democrats are going to try and are going to face a party fissure, very similar to the ones that the Republicans faced in 2009 with the Tea Party movement. As far as policies go with the Democrats, if he wins, I think they will continue to have this disconnect with items that are at the top of the list of voter concerns. If you go and look at Gallup and Pew, the top of the list for voters is the economy, healthcare, COVID, violent crime. Instead, Democrats seem to focus very much lately on things that are lower down the list: climate change, gun control, abortion. If they go into office and go far left and overreach and go for these other issues that are not so important to voters, I think the 2022 midterms and his reelection will be very difficult. So one last thought that I thought I'd share with you is what I think is fascinating, the shifting demographics due to COVID. I'll show you one last slide real quick before I hand it over to David. And here is this one. This is on the left here, you see 1 in 10 young adults has already moved because of COVID. 3 times more young people than 30 to 45-year-olds. And on the right, you see a Harris poll, which is how likely are you to move? So you haven't moved yet. Are you thinking about it? And out of the urban areas, you've got 20%, and 19% somewhat likely, 17% very likely. And out of the suburbs, somewhat or very likely is close to 50%. I find that absolutely fascinating, and think that this demographic shift of voters moving out of urban and suburban centers may change the urban-rural divide as we know it in this country. It may change which states become battleground states, and in fact, it may change the outcome of future elections. And nobody seems to have noticed that yet. Nobody's talking about that. So I just thought I'd put that one up there as one last thought, because I think that may have the most far-reaching consequences in a lot of ways. So those are my thoughts on the current state of partisanship, the pandemic, and political parties. So with that, I thought I'd see if David has anything he'd like to ask or comment
on. Thank you. And thank you everyone for having us. I was curious. I wanted to just ask a few questions about a couple of different things that you said. One of them was, I thought you had your point about the shortage of poll workers in the United States and the challenge that the US is facing because of election administration. Seems like, I think it's hard to overstate just how strange this election is going to be and how changed it's going to be. Mm-hmm. What do you think because it seems like you're skeptical of mail being being the answer. What do you think states should be doing to try to deal with those problems?
So the first thing that I'm going to say to the students tomorrow is we're putting up links for how college students should be volunteering to be poll workers. And especially if they're on college campuses and they've got herd immunity and they're drinking beer and going to fraternity parties, let's get them to the polls and put them to work and let the retirees who are more vulnerable stay home. So that would be at the top of my list, would be have all 50 states, just as they do for census workers, by the way. They recruit heavily from college campuses for census workers, which I think is brilliant. So that'd be one thing. The second is, I think there needs to be a tremendous focus at the state level on how they're going to set up systems and even just storage areas and workspaces for all this incoming mail of all these ballots and how they're going to count them. I think there's been a lot more attention in previous elections to these voting machines and the hanging chads and election security and hacking and all that. I'm actually relieved that we go back to good old paper ballots, because I think the chances of getting hacked are much less. But if there could be a much faster ramp up in the next 6 weeks or so at the state level of more and more sort of office space and warehouse space to bring people in to help count, I think that would be a tremendous service to our country if people would try and help out with that.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think it's also a strong argument for drop boxes, these secure boxes.
I think drop boxes are a great idea. Yeah.
Another question that I had, because specifically you were talking about this issue that we're facing about, will the president accept the results? You mentioned Hillary Clinton had a comment. And I think I just thought it was important to clarify the specifics. I think what she was saying today was, if on election night the race is close, she doesn't think Biden should concede, because she thinks that once you count all the ballots that are coming in over the mail, that it seems likely, in her view, that the race would be, would ultimately be decided for Biden. That was true in a bunch of California races that were by mail earlier this year, where on election day, the Republican was ahead, but because the late mail vote favored the Democrat ended up winning the ballot votes. Do you think that there's going to be pressure on Biden, if he's behind in the election day count, to concede prematurely, or at least before all the votes have been counted?
I kind of doubt it. I mean, I remember very clearly in 2000 when Vice President Gore conceded and then took it back. Do you remember that? And that was pretty jaw dropping to me. So
I was in 8th grade, but I remember, so it was before my bedtime was too early, but the next morning.
Right. So I would think that is a worst case scenario. You don't want somebody to concede and then take it back. I think it would be smarter to hold off. As I recall, you probably know better than I do, but I don't think Hillary Clinton conceded on election night just now in 2016. I think she did it the next day. Isn't that right?
I'm trying to think. I believe Kerry did not concede on election night.
Yeah.
And I don't believe that
Clinton there is some precedent. Yeah. So I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. I believe Romney and McCain did, but the margins were also a little different in both of those.
McCain definitely did. Yeah.
Yeah. And so one other thing I'm curious about, I saw a lot of people talking yesterday about the post-Trump Republican Party, this idea that Nikki Haley and Tim Scott in particular, both politicians who are non-white, both kind of talking about the party, but not as much about Trump. We're trying to present a kind of post-Trump vision of the future. As a Republican speechwriter, how did you think about those speeches?
I thought they were out of the ballpark good. Tim Scott especially was really a spectacular closer, I thought. Went after Biden on policies, not on character assassination or anything like that. Made a very, very compelling case. His personal story is terrific. That line about going from cotton to Congress in one lifetime, and he just did a great job. I love this idea. I wrote many speeches over the years about the last American century, which was the 20th century when I was writing it. So it was the current century. But this idea of the next American century being better than the last one, I think is a very compelling, positive vision that I think really appeals to a lot of people and is a really optimistic look. And both Nikki Haley and Tim Scott strike me as deeply optimistic, forward-looking people, and their stories of their own lives and what they've overcome is tremendously inspiring. So I'm all favor those two. I think how great would that be if they were the next two leaders of the Republican Party? We'd be in great shape.
And then one last question I had for you is, you talked about policy at the Republican convention. I thought Tim Scott's speech was notable. He didn't say anything. He didn't use the word coronavirus, I don't believe, or he might have in the first sentence, but he didn't talk at all about what the future looks like in terms of the pandemic. And I think tonight, from what I've seen, it's sort of similar, that in as much as it's policy heavy, it's policy for a world in which there isn't a pandemic going on. If you were writing for the Republican convention, how would you address that? I think it would be an interesting challenge.
So I think they're struggling with the fact that they can't promise that there'll be a vaccine coming by X date or anything like that. There's so much uncertainty. We don't know if there's going to be a second wave, things like that. And so I think that's part of the reluctance. The best thing I've seen in terms of pandemic related rhetoric, since we're speechwriters, this is our idea of a good time to talk about, is I don't know if you saw it, but Tom Hanks gave a 5-minute virtual commencement address at Wright State University recently. And it is really good. And basically what he says to young people is, we all know what the before looked like with this pandemic. We don't know what the after is going to look like. And you are the generation that is going to get us through to after. And that is a calling, and that is their mission in life. And that is why it is so great that they're all graduating from college right now and moving out into the working world. And that is sort of the same message, I think, that the Republicans could borrow is, let's talk about what is the bridge between before and after, and how are we going to get from here to there. And that, I think, has a lot of creative answers to it. I think there's a lot of entrepreneurs. There's a lot of really talented people who have switched production lines to make PPE, that I mean, look at the people who've perfected all the Zoom backgrounds and stuff like this. There's a tremendous amount of creative energy in this country to try to see what our country is going to look like on the other side of this. And I think that's probably where I would send my clients if I was writing for prominent Republicans right now, because I think to get too far into the science is a little risky since there's so much uncertainty. It's more aspirational about the future of our country and the type of community we want to come out as on the other side.
Yeah, so here's what I would say. What I wanted to talk about for a couple of minutes was actually not so much about what's happening in the election between Biden and Trump, and not so much about what's happening right now with the different party conventions, and not even what is happening in the pandemic. Although I do think that what we're seeing in the pandemic is that it is kind of purely from a political perspective. The pandemic makes it a lot harder. Paul Begala, I think it was, the Clinton advisor, said the Titanic didn't have a communications problem, it had an iceberg problem. I think the coronavirus pandemic has become an iceberg problem for both the Republican Party at the moment, but also for other elements of American society. It's hard to deny, and it's hard to deny what's happening when the numbers are what they are. However, I think what I want to focus on instead is how I think about American politics today. And I think the most important and most overlooked element of American politics today. And that's the way that democracy, the fundamental system of government that we have, has changed, not just over the last 100 years or 200 years, but actually within my lifetime. And one of the things, and this obviously borrows a great deal from the book I just wrote, but one of the things that I learned as I was working on this book is that it's not just a matter of, the way that Americans tend to learn their history, which is essentially that we started off as a democracy, but one in which fairly few people could participate because of restrictions based on race and class and gender, and gradually increased. The story of American democracy is much more complicated. And as Mary Kate and I were talking about in the questions, I am still by most definitions a young person. I'm 33. And yet the country that I live in, the system of government that I live in, is completely different than the one that I was born into. And if you're watching this and you want to understand American politics, or frankly, if you're an American and you want to understand American politics better, understanding those changes, I would argue, is the single most important thing you could do. And I would also argue it's often overlooked. Generally speaking, in American life, we tend to look at politics as a contest, but we tend to focus on the players on the field. And we tend not to pay attention to the rules of the game. But when the rules of the game have changed substantially, that ultimately has an enormous outcome on what happens. And what I want to do with the rest of my time is just go through the three main areas that the rules of the game, the foundation of our democracy, what John Adams called the divine science of human happiness, has completely changed since I was born in 1986 or around then. So the first is this issue of who can vote. In 1980, when Ronald Reagan was first elected president, about 3.5% of Americans had no voting rights at all. That was nearly a historic low. Today, in the last election in 2016, about 8.8% of Americans couldn't vote, and that means they had no voting rights whatsoever. Then you add to that list some of the largest backsliding on voting rights that we've ever had in this country. Since the Voting Rights Act was passed, that was a sort of period of dramatic expansion. And then the last few decades, and the last decade in particular, we've seen an enormous contraction of voting rights. So just to give you one example, in the 2000 election, there was what's called a voter purge in Florida. It took 12,000 African Americans who were eligible to vote off the rolls. And at the time, that was a fairly dramatic way of keeping eligible voters from voting. In the last two election cycles, somewhere around 16 million Americans have been purged. A lot of them were not eligible voters because they had died or removed, but a sort of back of the envelope estimate that is trying to be relatively conservative would estimate about 1 in 6 of those voters is eligible to vote. So we're seeing enormous numbers of people who have voting rights, but they can't exercise them. And finally, as Mary Kate mentioned, election administration is an enormous barrier to many people voting. in the 2012 election, non-white voters were they waited twice as long on average as white voters, 23 minutes compared to 12 minutes. And if you were non-white, you were 6 times more likely to wait an hour or more in order to vote. So what we're seeing is along every single dimension, it's becoming harder and harder to have voting rights and to exercise those voting rights than it was when I was a kid. And in nearly all of those cases, that's being driven by politicians who are trying to win elections, not by persuading people to vote for them, but by taking the people who will vote for the other guy and pushing them out of the electorate, keeping them from voting. And that leads directly to polarization, because when you can win elections by appealing to your base and restricting the pool of people who can vote against you, that's often a very tempting incentive or a tempting alternative for politicians who don't really like to change. And so what's the right way to put it? It incentivizes against moderation. So that's the first big area, who can vote. The second big area in which American democracy has changed a great deal is in how much each vote matters. And I'm going to try to run through some of this kind of quickly, but it's very important to understand that if, for example, all of us on the Zoom were electing a president of the Zoom, we would naturally assume, we wouldn't have to talk about it, that everybody gets one vote and that each of those votes count equally to everyone else's. That is not the way our elections work for Congress or the Senate or the White House. The way I put it in my book is that the way we conduct our most important elections would cause a scandal in a parent-teacher association or a student election for student body president. And the reason for that is that if you look at the number of, for example, swing districts in Congress, those are districts that are competitive. They could go Democrat, they could go Republican. That number has fallen by more than half since the 1990s. Some of that is due to partisan gerrymandering, and then some of it, Mary Kate mentioned people moving from the cities to the suburbs or vice versa. Some of it is because of what's called urban clustering. So Democrats tend to be found in cities packed pretty densely, and that means they tend to be packed into uncompetitive congressional districts. And so when you look at it, the value, how much power each Democratic voter has, is actually just a tiny bit less than each Republican voter, but you multiply that across the country, and you have a situation where one party can win the House of Representatives despite not winning a majority of the voters. A second area in which you have votes mattering differently is the Senate. The Senate has always had 2 senators per state. There's a lot of interesting reasons why that happened, but the partisan impact of that is greater than it's ever been, and the demographic impact is greater as well. So just as an example, when America first started out, the smallest state, which was Delaware, had a population that was 1/13 the size of the largest state, which was Virginia. Today, Wyoming is the smallest state, and the largest state is California, which is 68 times larger. So what you end up seeing is an enormous skewing of the Senate towards smaller states, rural states, and they also happen to be disproportionately white states and Republican states as well. So that's another element driving American politics, and again, driving polarization, because when you can have, when you're essentially guaranteed 40 senators from the most conservative states, as the Republican Party currently is, it means that you have a very strong caucus against moderating and trying to get to, trying to get a bigger tent, so to speak. The final area is the Electoral College, which we can go into a little bit, but I think the important thing to recognize with the Electoral College, which doesn't actually benefit one party or the other. Obama could have lost the popular vote and won the Electoral College in 2012. But what the Electoral College does is it means that most of our votes don't really matter for president. Your odds of living in an Electoral College swing state used to be about 3 in 4 back in the 1960s. Today, they're less than 1 in 4. And so most Americans will cast a vote in a state where the outcome is essentially preordained. And I feel like I'm a perfect example of this. I live in Washington, D.C. So when I vote, there's zero question that those 3 electoral votes will go for Biden. And then on top of that, Washington, D.C. doesn't get representation in Congress. So we have no senators or congresspeople at all. So it's just an example of the ways in which the changing power of individual Americans' votes is changing our democracy. And then the final area is campaign finance laws. So the short version of the campaign finance system in the United States is that today it is now legal, and it was not until 2010, to basically spend as much money as you want on politics. There's a few different guardrails of describing how you can do that, but that didn't used to be legal, and now it's legal. And what that means is essentially, if you have a lot of money, your vote also matters more. Your preference does a lot more to elect politicians than it used to, whether you think that's a good or bad thing. Again, that's changed our democracy a great deal. The final area, so we talked about who gets to vote, we talked about whose votes matter and how much they matter. The final area I would just want to talk about is this question of how a bill becomes a law. Because once again, that legislative process, which is just, how does an idea move through Congress and become a law, that has changed a lot in my lifetime as well. It's changed a little bit in the House of Representatives. The biggest changes came in 1995 when Newt Gingrich took over as Speaker during the Bill Clinton presidency. He made a lot of changes, but we've seen other changes as well. For the most part, the House can pass bills. But one of the things that we see, this was a statistic that kind of surprised me a little bit. So not only are bills passing at a lower rate than ever in my lifetime, or I would imagine in just about everyone's lifetime on this call, in the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, I think you all know which asteroid I'm talking about, the big extinction event, a species odds of surviving that asteroid were actually 10 times greater than the odds of a bill becoming a law today. And part of the reason for that is the polarization we're describing. Another part of the reason for that is changes in the structure of the Senate. So the Senate had a filibuster, which basically means you don't need a majority of voters. Sorry, you can kill a bill with a minority of senators, but it takes a majority of senators to pass one. The Senate has had that since about 1837. That's changed and been in flux for a very long time, but beginning in 2008, the sort of new informal rule of the Senate is that you need 60 votes to pass nearly any piece of legislation. And as a consequence, I mean, it's very hard in American politics to get 60% of people to agree on anything. And so what you see is you're seeing it become nearly impossible for bills to pass. The final change that I think is just important to add to that is the role of the judiciary in America has changed as well. What we have seen is that the two parties have really differed in how they nominate judges and how they confirm judges and the role that they see judges playing. We can talk about the specifics of that, but the short version is Democrats have tended to prioritize diversity on the bench. So Jimmy Carter, for example, took a lot of control over the judicial nominating process, but he tried to make the judges more diverse. He added more female judges, things like that. The Republican Party has tended to prioritize ideological coherence or consistency over when they have the White House and the Senate and can confirm judges. And so what we've seen from that, I mean, is a couple of really unprecedented things recently. You see the President of the United States talking about flipping district courts, which is language you would normally use for a House seat or a Senate seat. And you actually see the Senate Majority Leader, so this is not just a Trump thing, Mitch McConnell has also talked about flipping courts. You've never seen that kind of language before. And also you see things, it's hard to remember what all the unprecedented things that have happened, but even just the fact that President Trump ran on a list of judges he would nominate was considered far beyond the pale when it happened just 4 years ago, and now it's considered fairly standard. So we're seeing that change as well. The independence of the judiciary is under attack, and because of that, it makes bills more likely to be retroactively unpassed, even if they do get through Congress. And of course, getting through Congress is harder than ever before. So those are the three big areas where American democracy has changed. And if, in my view, if you want to understand why Americans of both parties are so dissatisfied with their government and with their leadership, that explains a lot. Because Americans feel, over 80% of Americans do not trust Washington to do the right thing. When I was a kid, again, I think that number was about 50-50. And the reason that number has fallen so deeply is that Americans are right. Our government, our democracy is much less representative than it used to be. And the important thing to recognize about all of those elements, who gets to vote, how much each vote matters, and also how a bill becomes a law, is that these are changes that have happened for the most part without Americans' consent, certainly without Americans' desire for these changes, and in many cases without Americans' knowledge. So I'll just end by saying the thing that actually, as we go into this 2020 cycle, that gives me a great deal of hope is that what we're seeing for the first time is that this is an election in which the administration of elections, the questions of voting rights, the role of the Senate, including the filibuster, and all of these other foundational issues have become an issue in democracy itself. And I think if you looked at the Democratic Convention, one of the things you heard over and over again was this idea that democracy itself is on the ballot. I think that's probably true. I don't know for sure whether American democracy will survive another 4 years of Trump, but I wouldn't bet on it. And I think that and I think that's actually something so I'm going to end on sort of both a very dark note and a more uplifting one. What we're seeing right now in American democracy, there's a parallel here to our COVID response as a country. America thought that we were in the top tier, most developed countries when it came to the ability to handle a pandemic. It turns out, because of failures of leadership, primarily, and some other issues, America's peer countries, when it's come to COVID, have been countries that we would not have considered ourselves in league with: Russia, Brazil, countries like that. Similarly, when I've been talking to political scientists recently, what they were saying is, if you look at what is happening in this election, the president, for example, publicly saying that he is trying to sabotage the mail because he doesn't like mail-in voting and he thinks that he's not going to win the election if the election is held primarily or largely by mail. That's the kind of thing you would see in a sub-Saharan Africa. You might see in a post-Soviet country, but you would not expect to see that in a developed democracy. So I think one of the things that is hard for many. Oh, sorry, I'm seeing the chat there. Sorry about that. Anyway, I'll just wrap it up by saying it's hard for people to recognize the state that American democracy is in. But I think it's at the same time, we see the American people very much want to keep democracy around. So I apologize for going over. I had put the chat in the wrong spot, but hopefully I covered a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, I share some blame too, because I was not looking at the chat either when I was talking. Just a quick question before we go is, so a lot of the concerns that you have about, the Senate, the Electoral College, money in politics, the filibuster, things like that, seem to me they would run into constitutional legal challenges. Some of them may need constitutional conventions. Some of them may need constitutional amendments. How do you propose to get around some of those major concerns, since many of them are foundational issues to the founding of our country?
So nothing I'm talking about would require a constitutional amendment. Sometimes you could pass a constitutional amendment and it would do more. But when I've been thinking about these things, my general rule is I don't think about any solution that would require a constitutional amendment, because that process is basically never going to happen. Right. Nor do I expect, the way I put it is no constitutional amendments and nothing that would require Mitch McConnell's heart to grow 3 sizes one day. I don't think that we need to see people who are benefiting from the system as it is. They're not going to willingly change it. What you could do with a simple federal law is, well, first of all, before you even get to the federal lawmaking, you could end the legislative filibuster with a simple majority in the Senate.
Right.
You could ameliorate a lot of the campaign finance problems. You could promote public financing. You do a bunch of other stuff. You can't undo Citizens United, but you can change it. And then you can work around the Electoral College. And I don't want to go into that because I'm already over time. But you can do all of these different things that would essentially, it wouldn't mean that the Constitution changes, but it would mean that the basic underlying problem changes. And then I would also just quickly add, you can make DC and Puerto Rico states with a simple federal law, and that would enfranchise several million Americans and also begin to change some of the imbalance of power in the Senate as well.
Got it.
All right. Well, I want to thank you again to our speakers today, Mary Kate Carey and David Litt. The Center is honored to have played host to such an informative and timely discussion. Thank you as well to our viewers for attending this EWC Seminars live briefing. We hope you will join us on Tuesday, September 8th, to hear from a new generation of activists discuss how they're fighting back against inequality, systemic racism, and police brutality. And on September 22nd, hear comedians Dean Obadala and Jenny Yang discuss the power of satire in combating bigotry. Finally, pre-selected journalists participating in the closed Q&A, please do not log off or close Zoom. You are currently being promoted so that your video and audio are enabled. For those who wish to participate in future Q&A sessions with EWC Seminars Live Briefing speakers, please remember to register early. There is much greater interest than available slots. And to everyone, I say mahalo and aloha.